Grade 12 learners, welcome to today's history lesson. My name is Dimpon Tlamati. This lesson is brought to you by the Northern Cape Department of Education in collaboration with Phakama Research and Development. Now learners, today's topic is still the same as the previous lesson. It is the coming of democracy to South Africa and coming to terms with the past. The subtopic also is still the same, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now learners, if you can recall that last time we went through the examination guideline to actually understand the focus areas or the areas in which we need to focus on when we discuss this topic. So now the only thing that has changed will be the lesson objectives. Now today we are moving on to bullet point number 4. Bullet point number 4 is actually about the debates concerning the TRC. So by the end of this lesson, learners, you should be able to discuss the positive aspects of the TRC. You should also be able to explain the TRC's amnesty provision. Lastly, you should be able to discuss the problems with amnesty. Now, for your information, you can also refer to the CAPS document, page 30. Everything is stated there, stipulated clearly. And then you can also refer to the DBE 2021 examination guideline. And all this you will find on page 6. Now, just to repeat, learners, we are actually moving on to bullet point number 4, which is all about the debates concerning the TRC. So to be specific, today we will be looking at the positive aspects of the TRC. We will also be looking at the amnesty provision and the problems with amnesty. Now, without any waste of time, just to go back to the previous lesson on what you already know. Now, in the previous lesson, learners, we actually discussed the reasons for the TRC, which is actually why the TRC was established. We also discussed the two forms of justice. By now, you should be able to differentiate between the two, which is restorative justice and retributive justice. We also discussed the work of the TRC. Now, by looking at this picture, learners, I'm sure you can actually recall what we actually discussed to say the TRC wanted to ensure that there is reconciliation and healing of the past. And then the work of the TRC, you'll remember that the TRC moved from one province to another, listening to stories told by the victims and the perpetrators. Now, to actually help you to recall and to actually check your level of understanding as well, I would like you to answer these 4 questions. These questions are basically on the previous lesson. It's all about what we discussed in the previous lesson. So the first question that I want you to answer will be you defining the word amnesty. Now, question number 1 says, define amnesty in the context of the TRC. Question number 2, briefly explain the conditions of amnesty. Now, if you refer back to the previous lesson, remember the other reason why the TRC was established was to actually grant amnesty to perpetrators under certain conditions. Now here, question number 2, you are expected to explain those conditions as per our discussion in the previous lesson. Number 3, briefly explain the difference between retributive and restorative justice. These are the 2 forms of justice that we discussed in the previous lesson. Lastly, number 4, which form of justice did the TRC apply? Now, learners, I'm just going to give you 5 minutes to answer these 4 questions, and then we'll take it from there. Only 5 minutes, learners. Make sure you answer all of them so that we can move from the known to the unknown. Welcome back, learners. Hope you had enough time to answer all the 4 questions. Now, let us discuss the questions and the answers as well. Now, number 1, you were expected here to define amnesty, not just in general, but in the context of the TRC. Now, remember, learners, as we were discussing, I indicated to you that amnesty is the same as forgiveness. And in general, amnesty is official pardon granted to anyone who has committed a crime. But in the context of the TRC, or according to what we have learned about the TRC, amnesty is an official pardon or forgiveness for who? For someone. Now, if you don't want to say someone, you can actually replace someone with perpetrators. So you can say amnesty is an official pardon for perpetrators or someone who committed what? Politically not just the crime, learners, but the crime should be politically motivated. When? You can say during apartheid or between 1960 to 1994. Remember the period, learners. The TRC only focused on politically motivated crimes that were committed between 1960 to 1994. Now let's go to question number 2. Here you were expected to briefly explain the conditions of amnesty. What is it that the perpetrator had to do in order to be granted amnesty? What were the requirements? What were the requirements? Now, hopefully you still remember, learners. Number 1, the perpetrator had to disclose or tell the whole truth about the crime they committed. They had to disclose the whole truth on how they committed the crime, and when, and how, and where. And then the other one, they had to convince the TRC that the crime was politically motivated. And remember, amnesty was also granted to perpetrators who committed crimes between 1960 to 1994. Crimes that were committed before 1960 were not actually covered by the TRC. Now, let's go to number 3. Briefly explain the difference between retributive and restorative justice. So these are the 2 forms of justice. Now, restorative justice promotes what? Forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation. Between who? Between victims and perpetrators. Now, retributive justice is the opposite of restorative justice. Now, retributive justice promotes what? Revenge, prosecution, and punishment. Now, according to this form of justice, perpetrators should be punished. Perpetrators should be prosecuted for the crimes that they committed. Now, next question. Which form of justice did the TRC apply? Remember, the main aim of the TRC was to ensure that South Africans reconcile. The TRC was not a court of law where perpetrators could be prosecuted. The TRC only wanted to make sure that victims and perpetrators forgive each other. Victims and perpetrators reconcile so that they can be able to move on peacefully in a democratic South Africa. So which form of justice did the TRC apply? The TRC applied restorative justice, which is a form of justice that promotes healing and reconciliation between South Africans. To be specific, between victims and perpetrators. Now, learners, as we have discussed all the answers, remember the objectives of today's lesson. They are on actually the amnesty provision. So we will be talking more about amnesty and how the TRC provided amnesty to who? Who needed amnesty in this case? Remember, as per our discussion in the previous lesson, victims did not need amnesty. Who needed to be forgiven in this case? Who needed to be forgiven for the crimes that they committed? The answer is perpetrators. So we will be focusing more on how the TRC provided amnesty to perpetrators. Now, before we can even get into details, let us go through the concepts that we will be discussing or coming across throughout the lesson. The first one that we will be looking at is witch hunt. It's an investigation to uncover people suspected of a crime, particularly those with opposing views, with the purpose of exposing them. Now let us go through the definition. It says it's an investigation to uncover people suspected of a crime, but often as means of undermining those with opposing views. Now the second concept, controversial, an issue which people have strong and widely differing views. So now here it's an issue where you find that some are in support and some are against. In this case, it means people have different views about this particular situation. Therefore, we say that situation is controversial. Concept number 3 is testimony. Now, this is a statement or confession on gross human rights violations or crimes committed during apartheid. This can be a statement or a confession by the perpetrator about the crimes that he or she committed during apartheid. Or it can be a statement given by the victim before the TRC on how their rights were actually violated. Now that confession, that statement, it can be a written or a spoken statement that is known as a what? A testimony. And then prosecution, the action of charging someone in a court of law for a criminal behavior. That is prosecution. Right, learners, moving on to today's lesson. Remember, the main focus of today's lesson is on the debate concerning the TRC. Now, when the TRC was established, there are those people who were in support of the TRC. They actually thought that the formation of the TRC was actually a good thing. So now that South Africans will be able to reconcile. And then there is that group now that was actually against the formation of the TRC. They actually felt that the formation of the TRC was not a good idea. But from this lesson, we are actually going to look at the TRC from a positive side. We are actually going to look at the positive aspects of the TRC. Now we are going to look at the TRC as an instrument of reconciliation. Remember, going back to the aims of the TRC, why was the TRC established? It was to investigate gross human rights violations of 1960 to 1994. And also, after getting the information about those gross human rights violations, the TRC would then start the process of reconciliation. Now, today we are actually going to look at how the TRC made it possible for South Africans to reconcile. How did the TRC actually try by all means to make sure that South Africans reconcile? Now, I'm sure you can actually come up with few points to say how did the TRC, based on what we actually discussed in the previous lesson, you can come up with few points on how the TRC tried to achieve reconciliation in South Africa. Now, the first point will be the TRC actually gave victims an opportunity to tell their side of the story. It did not end there, learners. Perpetrators were also accommodated. How? They were actually allowed to apply for amnesty. Now, when they applied for amnesty, they were also given an opportunity to tell how they actually violated human rights. So the first point actually confirms what I just said, learners. It says the TRC provided a platform for victims to share their stories. Now, here they would just share how their rights were violated. They would share to the public and share to the whole commission on how their rights were violated. So it means victims were also accommodated by the TRC. Now, perpetrators would ask for what? For amnesty. Now, remember the requirements. They would not just ask for amnesty. It would not just end there. They would have to tell the whole truth on how they committed the crime. Now, a mere telling of the stories of victims and survivors in public. Remember, I said they were doing it in public. And remember, these hearings were broadcasted live on radio and television, and also published in newspapers. So it was in public. It provided some healing for many people. So now these hearings were done in public. So this gave people an opportunity to heal, particularly victims. Victims got closure when perpetrators told the whole truth on how they actually committed the crime, on what actually happened when they committed the crime or when they violated human rights. Maybe they might have been asking themselves questions all along on what really happened. So now this was an opportunity for them to get closure and get details on how those crimes were actually violated, how their loved ones were murdered if they had died, and how they were actually murdered or tortured. So now them getting those details also enabled them to get closure. So now, which actually started the whole process of reconciliation. Now it says there, some victims, after hearing those stories on how perpetrators committed the crimes or how they murdered their loved ones or tortured their loved ones, they were actually willing to forgive perpetrators or forgive perpetrators for murdering or torturing their loved ones. So now if they were able to forgive, it means now the process of reconciliation was becoming successful. It means now what the TRC actually wanted was now actually happening, as victims were now willing to forgive those perpetrators. Now this point is saying some victims of gross human rights violations and members of their families were able to forgive perpetrators, especially when they showed what? When they showed remorse. Now I want us to go back to this point. It says some victims. Now, victims got closure when perpetrators told the truth about what happened. Now, it basically means that sometimes victims or the families would be asking themselves or have been asking themselves what exactly transpired or happened. Now, when they heard the details or when they got an opportunity to hear how their loved ones were murdered and tortured, then they were able to actually get closure. They were able to get answers for the questions that they have been asking themselves all along. And sometimes you'd find that some of the victims had actually disappeared. The families have been asking themselves what exactly happened to them. Now, when the perpetrators reveal all the information and give them direction on where to look for their loved ones, then in that case they were able to get closure as their questions would be answered. So now this actually also, when they got closure, it started the process of reconciliation. Now some victims, again together with their families, were now willing to forgive perpetrators after hearing the stories, after hearing the truth on how the crimes were violated. Now, if victims and their families were now willing to forgive, now I want you to know this, learners, it does not say all the victims, it says some. So it means some were willing to forgive after getting all the details and after getting the answers to their questions. They were now able to forgive. Now, if they were able to forgive the perpetrators, it means now the TRC was actually getting what it had been looking for, which is making sure that South Africans reconcile. It means the TRC was actually becoming successful. Now let us look at the last bullet point. It's basically what I said, learners. It says some victims of gross human rights violations and members of their families were able to forgive perpetrators, especially when they show what? They show remorse. Now, indeed, the TRC was actually an instrument of reconciliation because at some point, victims rather were able to forgive perpetrators. At some point, again, victims were able to get closure after getting the details, after getting the answers from the perpetrators, where they were given an opportunity. Remember, perpetrators were given an opportunity to tell how they committed the crime. Okay, learners, now we are done with the positive aspects of the TRC, where we have now noticed that indeed the TRC was actually an instrument to reconciliation. Now, remember when we started, I said to you in the slide, I said there are those who were against the TRC. This actually also falls under the debates concerning the TRC. So now we are now going to look at the reasons why they were against the TRC. What reasons did they give for not supporting the TRC? Now let us look at the reasons why they were actually against the TRC. What reasons did they give for being against the TRC? Now the first one says some people or some South Africans wanted the TRC to apply which form of justice? They wanted the TRC to apply retributive justice. Remember, retributive justice promotes what? Revenge. It also promotes prosecution and punishment. Now, according to this form of justice, perpetrators of gross human rights violations should be prosecuted. They should also be punished. So this is the form of justice that this group that was against the TRC wanted. They were against the fact that now the TRC is applying which form of justice? Restorative justice. Now, it says some opposed the whole idea of the TRC, believing that it would reopen wounds that were already starting to heal. Remember, the TRC was established in 1995. Now, victims had to appear before the TRC and tell stories that actually, or tell their side of the stories about the crimes that were committed when? During apartheid. So chances are, they are saying, chances are those wounds were already starting to heal. Victims were starting to forget about what happened. Now they were expected to go back to the TRC and tell again what actually happened or how their rights were violated. So they argued to say the TRC was actually opening wounds that were starting to heal. Now, one other reason did the TRC, or rather, did the group that was against the TRC give for opposing the commission? It says some whites ignored the proceeding and thought that the past should be left alone. They actually thought that the past should be left in the past. There is no need for South Africans to be talking about crimes that were committed in the past, crimes that were committed during apartheid. They actually regarded the TRC rather as a witch hunt. Now remember the concept as a witch hunt. Now, there are those families who actually tried to stop the process of the TRC by actually approaching the Constitutional Court, demanding that the whole process of the TRC should be stopped, because they believed that if it continues, they will never get justice. Remember, as per the first bullet point on why some people were against the TRC, they were against the idea that the TRC was applying retributive justice. It says here, some families were critical of the process, notably the family of Black consciousness leader Steve Biko and others. They applied unsuccessfully. It means they did not win. They did not win. They wanted the whole process of the TRC to actually stop, but they did not win. It says they applied unsuccessfully to the Constitutional Court for the whole process to be stopped. But unfortunately, the TRC, actually as per the ruling of the Constitutional Court, the TRC process had to proceed. So learners, we have actually discussed how the TRC played a very important role in making sure that reconciliation takes place in South Africa. But at the same time, we have noticed that there was also a group of South Africans that was against the TRC. So learners, the next slide is on the Amnesty Commission. Now, this takes us back to the three committees of the TRC. You'll remember that one of them is known as the Committee on Amnesty. Now, who needed amnesty here, learners? We know perpetrators of gross human rights violations needed amnesty. So basically, this committee focused more on the perpetrators. Now, what was the task of this committee? If you may remember, number one, this committee actually gave perpetrators an opportunity to apply for amnesty. It gave perpetrators of gross human rights violations of 1960 to 1994 to apply for amnesty. Now, it did not end there. It also gave them an opportunity to disclose the whole truth on what actually transpired or happened, and then convince the TRC that the crimes were politically motivated. So it says perpetrators had to apply for amnesty in relation to each of their offense. It did not end there. Provide full disclosure of the offense and prove that their actions were politically motivated. So it doesn't mean that now, remember, it doesn't mean that amnesty was automatically given to everyone who applied for amnesty. There were what? This takes us back to the conditions. There were conditions. Now, the next thing, I want us to take note of the next bullet point. This point actually proves to us that amnesty was not automatically granted. It says here, amnesty was by no means automatic. This basically means that not every perpetrator or all perpetrators who applied for amnesty actually got it. Remember the question. You might be asked, why do you think the TRC only granted amnesty to 1,167 perpetrators? what happened to their 5,945 perpetrators? Why were they not granted amnesty? So I just want you to think of the answers, learners. What reasons did they actually, or rather, what reasons did the TRC actually give for not granting the 5,945 perpetrators amnesty? Now, these are the answers. I'm sure your answers are similar to mine. By now, you should be knowing. This refers back to the conditions. It basically means that the 5,945 perpetrators did not meet what? The requirements. Remember, it means they did not disclose the whole truth on how they committed the crime. They did not disclose the truth about the gross human rights violations. The other reason will be, it means that the crimes that they committed were not politically motivated. And one other reason that you can give in this case, it means that, or you can give in this case is, it means that maybe the crimes that they committed were committed before 1960. Remember, the TRC only focused on the crimes that were committed between 1960 and 1994, or from 1960 to 1994. All the crimes that were committed before 1960 were not actually covered or accommodated by the TRC. Now, when you are asked to say, why did the TRC grant amnesty to 1,167 perpetrators? It's actually the opposite. Here you can say it means they disclosed the whole truth about the crimes that they committed, and their crimes were politically motivated. Now, learners, as much as many perpetrators came forward to apply for amnesty, and as much as others were granted amnesty, not everybody was happy with the amnesty provision. The issue of amnesty was actually a controversial issue. So it means some were in support, people had different views about it, some were in support and some were against. And I'm sure you know by now to say those who were against the idea of perpetrators being granted amnesty, they wanted perpetrators to actually be prosecuted. They actually wanted revenge. So it says there, some of the victims or their families were angry that perpetrators of gross human rights violations escaped punishment. Remember, after being granted amnesty, it means perpetrators were now free from prosecution. They were free. They were not going to be prosecuted or face jail time. Many victims found it difficult to accept that people who were guilty of heinous crimes should be allowed to walk free simply by just telling the truth, simply by making a public confession and apology. They felt that it was not enough. They wanted them to be prosecuted. Some victims were angered by the fact that not all those who applied for amnesty actually showed remorse for their actions. Remember, remorse was not one of the conditions for amnesty, but victims felt that it was important for perpetrators to also show remorse. So they were actually against the idea that some of the perpetrators were granted amnesty without showing remorse, simply by telling the truth and also convincing the TRC that their crime was politically motivated. Perpetrators who did not apply for amnesty had to be prosecuted, but there are perpetrators who refused to appear before the TRC and nothing happened to them. After that, they were not prosecuted. They were still free. One example is the National Party leader P.W. Botha, who refused to apply for amnesty or refused to account for the crimes that were committed under his leadership during the apartheid, and he was not prosecuted. So this actually made people to be against the idea of amnesty provision. They were against the idea that now perpetrators were granted amnesty and those who refused to appear before the TRC were not actually punished. Now, learners, we are moving to the first activity of the day, which is based on what we have discussed. So we will go through the source. I'm sure you know by now to say the first thing that you need to do is to go through the key question. How did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission attempt to promote reconciliation in South Africa? Now it goes back to the TRC being an instrument for reconciliation. The source below was taken from a book written by Mampela Rampele and deals with the reasons why P.W. Botha refused to cooperate with the TRC. It's basically what we discussed to say one of the people who refused to take full responsibility or account to the TRC is P.W. Botha. And we know that P.W. Botha was one of the leaders of the National Party and crimes were committed under his leadership. Now, he was actually asked to go to the TRC or appear before the TRC, but he refused. It says another controversial case was that of the former president, Mr. P.W. Botha. He refused to cooperate with the TRC, rejecting it as an instrument that seeks to dishonor Afrikaner history and the contribution his ancestors made to South Africa. Tutu tried to convince him in many ways. He was given months to answer questions from the TRC. Tutu visited Botha at his home in the wilderness, Southern Cape, to try to persuade him to accept responsibility for the policies that had been followed under his watch. Botha was without remorse until the bitter end. According to him, the Afrikaners did nothing wrong. They were only fulfilling their God-given responsibilities to defend Christian national values against terrorists and communists. Tutu treated Botha with great respect and reverence, even if he did not agree with his views. The court addressed Botha for disregarding a summons to appear before the TRC. Even in court, Tutu did not turn his back on Botha and the chance to heal the country. He proposed to Botha to admit that his government's policies had led to misdeeds by various government officials and that he was sorry. But Botha was stubborn to the bitter end. Some members of the commission felt that Tutu had bent over backwards to meet a culprit or criminal who showed no remorse. This was not just any person, but someone who held a leadership position. Shouldn't he have accepted responsibility for human rights abuses during a system of government he was the head of for so long? Others again pointed to the risks of humiliating President Botha at that time. Given the fragility of the new democracy, there was a danger that the right wing could rise up. Learners, use the source, which is source 2b, to answer the following questions. That will be question 2.2.1 to 2.2.4. I'm going to give you 10 minutes to answer all the questions, then we move on to the answers. Welcome back, learners. Hope you had enough time to answer the questions and hopefully also remembered to adhere to the mark allocation, because the mark allocation is very important as it guides you on how many answers to give for each question. Now let us go through the answers. Now 2.2.1 says, why according to the source? This means that the answer is in the source. This is a level 1 question. It's an extraction question. You are expected to take the answer from the source as it is. So now it says, why according to the source did P.W. Botha reject the TRC? Now you go back to the source. When you go back to the source, it says there, he refused to cooperate with TRC, rejecting it as an instrument that seeks to dishonor Afrikaner history and the contribution his ancestors made to South Africa. Now, if you are not sure, learners, my advice, not sure where the answer is, or if you are unable to actually identify the answer, sometimes you can also look at the clues or the keywords in the question vis-a-vis the ones that are in the source. Now, if you go through the question, there is the word there, reject. P.W. Botha, reject. And when you go through the source, then you see the word reject as well. It means the answer is somewhere there. So now you can use the clues and the keywords to find the answer. So now here are the two answers. Remember the mark allocation, 2 times 1, 2 answers, 1 mark each. So the answer is he rejected it as he saw it as an instrument that seeks to dishonor Afrikaner history and dishonor the contribution his ancestors made to South Africa. Now let's move on to 2.2.2. Comment on the attitude towards the work of the TRC by A. P.W. Botha. Now we've seen that P.W. Botha showed no remorse. He refused to appear before the TRC. He refused to take responsibility or accountability for the crimes that were committed under his leadership. So the answers that you can give, but not limited to, remember this one is not an extraction question, it's an interpretation question. So any other relevant answer in this case will be credited. So it says, shows no remorse. He showed no remorse, had no respect for the position of Tutu or the TRC. Even when the TRC actually summoned him or asked him to appear before the TRC, he still refused, which is an indication of disrespect. Now going to B, Desmond Tutu's attitude showed respect and empathy for former enemies. Even when P.W. Botha refused to appear before the TRC, Tutu still respected him. Tutu still showed him respect. Now let's go to 2.2.3. Why do you think it was important for P.W. Botha to appear before the TRC? By now, I think you might be having some ideas or answers to this question. As per our discussion, remember I said P.W. Botha is one of the National Party's leaders. So crimes were committed under his leadership. So it was important for him to appear before the TRC to take full responsibility and accountability and actually ask for amnesty for those crimes, so that victims can also get closure and for South Africans to reconcile and move on peacefully in a democratic country. So it says here, P.W. Botha was the leader of the government that had committed atrocities. As I indicated, he was one of the leaders of the National Party government, and under his leadership, atrocities or crimes were committed, human rights were violated. To take responsibility for acts of human rights violation and ask for amnesty. to just take full responsibility for what actually happened under his leadership, to take full responsibility for the crimes that actually were committed under his leadership, and ask for what? For amnesty, to heal the nation and show remorse for apartheid crimes. Now again, this is an interpretation question. It's not an extraction question. It did not say according to the source learners, so any other relevant answer again will be credited. And it doesn't mean that your answer should be exactly as the ones that are here or appearing here, but if they are similar to the ones that are appearing here, it means you are correct. 2.2.4. Comment on the limitation of the source to whom? To a researcher studying the TRC hearings. Now learners, the word limitation is from the word limit. Now when you limit, it means you are not revealing everything. So now in this case, when we look at the limitations, we are actually looking at what is missing from this source. What is missing from this source? What is it that is not revealed by this source to a person or a researcher studying the TRC hearings? Now, it says it is biased or one-sided. It means now it only shows one perspective or one view about the TRC. It does not show both sides. So the other side is not revealed. Now, why are we saying it is biased or one-sided? It only outlines the human rights violations of the National Party. So it means in order for you to be able to answer this question, you should be well informed rather about the TRC. So now, based on what we discussed, we know that the National Party is not the only political party that is responsible for the crimes that were committed during apartheid. Liberation movements, those political parties that were fighting against apartheid, also committed crimes. But when we read this source, it's all about the National Party and P.W. Botha. Nothing is being said about the liberation movements, and nothing is being said about those liberation movements having to appear before the TRC to actually take full responsibility. So in this case, this source is biased, or it is one-sided. It only outlines human rights violations that were committed by the National Party. And then it does not reveal the atrocities. It's basically what I said. It does not reveal the atrocities or crimes that were committed by the liberation movement. So now, both sides are not shown here. Only one side. We are being told about the negative things that were done on the atrocities that were committed by the National Party, and nothing about the liberation movement. So that means that this source is not revealing everything. The information about the liberation movement is actually missing. It does not indicate that some members of the liberation movement also refused to appear before the TRC or did not publicly acknowledge their wrongdoings. It only tells us about P.W. Botha being the only one who refused to appear before the TRC. It doesn't tell us about members of the liberation movements also refusing to appear before the TRC. So therefore, this source is not revealing everything. This source has what? Limitations. Source 2C. Now, if you analyze source 2C, source 2C is actually a visual source about what source 2B was actually telling us. Now, remember in source 2B, we read about P.W. Botha refusing to appear before the TRC. And Desmond Tutu trying by all means to convince him to appear before the TRC, but he still refused. Now here we have a visual source, which is a cartoon by Zapiro. It says it focuses on P.W. Botha's reluctance to appear before the TRC. Now we have a giant there, which is P.W. Botha. And we have Desmond Tutu. Now, learners, how do we identify Desmond Tutu in a cartoon? Long chin. And remember, he is an archbishop, then with a collar as well. The collar there is an archbishop. And also the long nose, that will be your archbishop, Desmond Tutu. Remember, in this case, he was the chairperson of the what? Of the TRC. And he's trying very hard to pull P.W. Botha to pull him to the TRC. Remember, the previous source actually indicated that he tried to convince him. And now he's trying very hard in this visual source to make sure that he actually appears before the TRC. And you can see that he's not winning. He's trying very hard. Look at the size of the figures. You can see that he's indeed, the size in this case, the cartoonist actually shows or portrays P.W. Botha as being this giant, which made it difficult for Desmond Tutu to actually pull him towards the TRC. Now, let us refer to source 2C to answer these two questions. 2.3.1. What messages are conveyed by the cartoon regarding the reaction of Botha towards the TRC? Again, let us not ignore, just going back to the cartoon again, let us not ignore what is written there. It says, trying to land the big one. Who is the big one in this case? P.W. Botha. And you can see that there is a pen there. It says small fry. It means there are those perpetrators who actually appeared before the TRC, but in this case, they were not leaders. They were not leaders of the political parties that actually committed crimes. In this case, who was big? The P.W. Botha was regarded as big because he was one of the leaders of the National Party. So now let's go to 2.3.1. What messages are conveyed by the cartoon regarding the reactions of P.W. Botha towards the TRC? Mark allocation 2 times 2. So in this case, it means you need 2 answers. 2.3.2, identify the leader who was driving the TRC process. Now we know who was the leader of the TRC, who was the chairperson of the TRC. Going to give you 5 minutes to actually answer these 2 questions, then we move on. Welcome back, learners. Hope you had enough time to answer the questions. Let us go through the answers. What messages are conveyed by the cartoon? Learners, the last part is very important. It doesn't say by the cartoon in general. It says regarding the reaction of P.W. Botha towards the TRC. So now here are the answers that you can give. It says P.W. Botha was resisting to appear before the TRC. As you can see that it was not easy for Desmond Tutu to actually pull him towards the TRC. It was actually difficult. So therefore that is an indication that he was resisting. The TRC tried to bring P.W. Botha to the TRC hearings, the pulling part. It means the TRC, under the leadership of Desmond Tutu, was trying very hard to convince him to appear before the TRC. Tutu had a challenge of ensuring that P.W. Botha appears before the TRC, again the pulling part, which makes it, which is an indication that it was not easy. 2.3.1, identify the leader who was driving the TRC process. Now the answer is Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Now moving on to the next question. Next activity, in this case, it's a comparison question. Here it says compare source 2B, not just any source, learners, 2B and 2C. Explain how the information in source 2B supports. Now, the examiner can actually decide to replace supports with differ or contradicts. So in this case, you are being expected to compare and explain how source 2B supports the evidence in source 2C, not in general, regarding the work of the TRC. So the last part again is very important. Mark allocation 2 times 2. So here it means, learners, you are expected to compare twice. Remember, when you compare, you are expected to look at or discuss two things at the same time. In this case, that will be 2C and 2B. So for you to be allocated 4 marks, you need to compare twice. It means first bullet point, you need to talk about 2B and 2C. Now, for you to get another 2 marks, you have to go back and compare for the second time, where again, you look at the similarities between these two sources, how they support each other, how are they similar. So you go back again to compare again for the second time, so that you can get another 2 marks. So first comparison, it will be 2 marks. Second comparison, 2 marks. Again, learners, I'm giving you 3 minutes to answer this question. Then we move on to the next part of the activity. Thank you. Welcome back, learners. Let us go through the answers. Now, remember 2.4, you are expected to compare. And then for you to be allocated 4 marks, you need to compare twice. What are we comparing? 2B and 2C. Regarding what? Regarding the work of the TRC. Now, let us go through the answers. Source 2B states, you cannot say source 2B shows. It's not a visual source, it's a written source. So a written source either explains, a written source states, a written source outlines. You cannot say a written source shows. You know that source 2B is a written source and source 2C is a visual source. So now with a visual source shows or conveys or demonstrates. So in this case, let's go through the answers. Source 2B states that Tutu tried to persuade P.W. Botha to appear before the TRC. Again, it's not an extraction question. Now, even if you are taking the answer from the source, you need to paraphrase. Use your own words. Now, in this case, it says Tutu tried to persuade P.W. Botha to appear before the TRC. Now, after that, you don't skip a line or no space. You just combine the 2 sentences with the word and. Remember, you are looking at 2 sources at the same time. You are comparing. Now, and source 2C shows. Remember, it's a visual source. How Tutu is struggling to get P.W. Botha to appear before the TRC. Now, for that answer, for discussing both 2C and 2B, in the first bullet point, you will be given 2 marks. 2 marks will be allocated to that answer. Now, remember the mark allocation is 2 times 2. So it means you need to go back and compare again for the other 2 marks. So now let's go back again. Source 2b indicates that Tutu was bending his back to convince P.W. Botha to appear before the TRC. And source 2c literally shows Tutu bending. It shows Tutu bending his back, trying to pull P.W. Botha to the TRC. Now again, 2 marks. So this is how the 4 marks is allocated. You need to compare twice. It's a comparison question. But remember, it will not always be about the similarities or how the evidence supports each other. It can be about how the evidence differs. So you need to be careful when it comes to this one. Let us not assume that it will always be about how the sources or the evidence in the sources supports each other. So let's go to source 2D. Will be used for the paragraph question. Remember, with the paragraph question, you are expected to refer to different sources, but not all the sources, relevant sources. You refer to sources that are relevant. So now in this case, source 2D will be used for the paragraph question. Now let us quickly go to the paragraph question. Now in this case, it doesn't mean that you will only use source 2D. You will use all the sources, including source 2D. So this basically means that it will be from source 2B, 2C, and 2D. Now in this case, it says, using the information in the relevant sources. Now this is a level 3 question. Here you are expected to interpret and synthesize. Now again, you are not allowed to extract the answers from the sources. If the answer is from the source, you need to paraphrase. You need to write it in your own words. Now, you are not only expected to write answers from the sources only, you are also allowed to use your own knowledge as per the instruction. It says using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge. Write a paragraph of about 8 lines, which is about 80 words. But unlike in other subjects where we are expected to count the words, in history we are not expected to count the words. But it is a guideline to say of about 80 words rather, explaining how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission attempted to promote reconciliation in South Africa. Now, one thing that you need to know is that the key question is always the same as the paragraph question. If you recall, when we went through the key question, it was similar to what the paragraph question is asking. So the key question is always the same as the paragraph question. So that is why it's important for you to go through the key question when you get the question paper, so that when you are answering short questions, you'd also be trying to get answers for the paragraph question. So now it says, write a paragraph of about 80 words or 8 lines explaining how the Truth and Reconciliation Commission attempted. What is to attempt, learners? It's to try. Attempted to promote what? Reconciliation. Now, I'm sure we are familiar with this concept, learners. Now, bringing together or uniting former enemies and restoring their friendly relations. Now, this is where former enemies actually come together and put the past in the past. The mark allocation for the paragraph question is always 8 marks. Now, things not to do when you answer your paragraph question, you do not use bullet points. Now, the instruction here says, write a paragraph. Now, a paragraph does not have bullet points. One other thing that you are not allowed to do, learners, as I have indicated, you are not allowed to copy the information from the source as it is. You need to paraphrase. Now let's go to the question. It says using the information, use, not copy, use the information in the relevant sources. Relevant, only the sources that will be helping you to answer the question. And your own knowledge. So you are allowed to bring in your knowledge, what you learned in class about how the TRC tried to promote reconciliation. Write a paragraph, not paragraphs, paragraph. So it means here the instruction says write one paragraph. You are not allowed to skip a line and write another paragraph. In that case, you will be penalized because the question says write a what? Write a paragraph. Now I'm going to give you 10 minutes to answer the question. Welcome back, learners. Now let us go through the answers. Now, learners, the first thing that you need to do when you answer your paragraph question, you need to have what we call an opening statement. The statement actually gives the marker or the person that will be reading an idea of what the whole paragraph is all about. And that statement should always be in line with what the question is asking. So in this case, remember, the question says, explaining how the TRC attempted to promote reconciliation in South Africa. Now, the first statement, which gives a marker and a reader an idea of what the paragraph is all about, says the TRC attempted to promote reconciliation in South Africa. So in this case, it means this whole paragraph is all about how the TRC attempted to promote reconciliation in South Africa. Now, can you see that this statement is actually in line with what the question is asking? It's not different. So in this case, when you write your paragraph, always have that opening statement that guides and gives the marker or the reader an idea of what the whole paragraph is all about. Now, the other thing that you are expected to do is to acknowledge your sources. Tell where or state where your information comes from. Now, let us look at the first answer for this paragraph question. Remember, the one that is highlighted is not the answer. It is an opening statement that actually gives the reader or the marker an idea of what the paragraph is all about, but it does not actually answer the question. Now, it says, first answer, we are referring to the TRC. It was formed to investigate the truth about human rights violations. Now, where does the information come from? As much as I did not extract the information, but this information comes from source 2A. It means here that I paraphrased. But even if I paraphrased, it still comes from source 2A. So I need to indicate that it's from source 2A. And you cannot write something like S2A. It's not allowed. You need to write the word source in full, then 2A. It offered full amnesty to perpetrators who disclosed the whole truth about the crimes they committed. Where does the information come from? It comes from source 2A again. Remember, the question said, or the instruction says, using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge. So therefore, you are allowed to use the information from the sources as long as you don't actually quote or extract. As it is, you need to paraphrase. The TRC provided a platform for victims and perpetrators to meet each other. Where does the information come from? From my own knowledge, from what I learned in class. It also created an opportunity for victims to freely talk about their suffering. Where does the information come from? Own knowledge. Tutu, the chairperson of the TRC, tried to convince P.W. Botha to appear before the TRC. Where does the information come from? The visual source. Remember the visual source where we saw Tutu pulling P.W. Botha to appear before the TRC. So you acknowledge that to see. Reparations were given to victims of gross human rights violations to make up for the loss or damages caused. Own knowledge. Many victims found closure at the TRC. Own knowledge. By signing the register, many South Africans publicly showed their commitment to reconciliation. Source 2D. So that is how you are expected to answer, learners. You need to paraphrase, have an opening statement, and acknowledge the sources. Actually tell where the information comes from, either from one of the sources or your own knowledge. Now, learners, we have reached the end of today's lesson. So let us just summarize what we discussed throughout the lesson. Remember, we have looked at the debates concerning the TRC. Now, the positive aspect of the TRC, it says the TRC gave victims an opportunity to tell their stories, which actually made it possible for the TRC to also start the process of reconciliation. Perpetrators were able to apply for amnesty and tell how they violated human rights during apartheid. The process enabled the TRC to discover the truth. Which process? The process of amnesty, where they allow perpetrators to apply for amnesty and disclose the truth. That whole process enabled the TRC to discover the truth and start the process of reconciliation. Now, there were those who were against the TRC, remember. What reasons did they give for not supporting the TRC? Those who looked at the TRC from a negative side. It says some people believe that it was reopening wounds that were starting to heal. Some victims wanted the TRC to apply retributive justice instead of restorative justice. This basically means that they wanted what? They wanted revenge. They wanted perpetrators to be prosecuted. They did not like the fact that perpetrators of heinous crimes were made to walk free without facing jail time. Some of the perpetrators, like P.W. Botha, refused to appear before the TRC or take full responsibility of the atrocities that they committed during apartheid. Remember, as I indicated, that P.W. Botha was one of the National Party's leaders, and atrocities or human rights violations were actually committed under his leadership. So therefore, it was important for him to appear before the TRC and take full responsibility and ask for amnesty. Thank you for watching, but now let us look at what is going to be discussed in the next lesson. We will still be focusing on the debates concerning the TRC, but this time we will not be focusing on the amnesty provision. We will be looking at reparations. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Goodbye.